Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. And I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And Mark, there have been a lot of different things going on. One of the topics we wanted to make sure we talk about is the Conference of Presidents vote. And what the Conference of Presidents is.
Yeah. As far as I understand, the Conference of Presidents was formed about 1956 because the Eisenhower administration perceived there to be lots of Jewish organizations out there with their own positions and parties. I guess the administration wanted a way to find public opinion within the Jewish community without having to poll every single aspect.
So they didn't like 2 Jews, 3 opinions?
They didn't like, it's the old
50
story.
organizations, 150 opinions?
Yeah, a number of years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, there was a Jewish delegation that went to visit the Pope at that point, and 13 organizations showed up, and I think the Pope was bewildered. Who are all these guys? B'nai B'rith and everybody else.
With completely different
different
views.
Platforms. Right, who represents the Jews. So it's been a very successful organization for over these years with a pretty broad platform based on mainstream desires. The Jewish community wants to support Israel. It wants to support the Jewish populations across the world and everything in between.
And there is a wide range of organizations that are part of this, including American Friends of Likud, AIPAC, American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, the Joint Distribution Community,
JCPA,
so, federations, Reform Movement, Conservative Movement, Orthodox Movement.
And a number of relatively left-wing organizations, too, including Americans for Peace Now and Amenu.
And so what is the basis of the controversy that's arisen? We had a number of organizations, I think 2 or 3 apply to become members of
conference.
The conference this year, including Alpha Epsilon Pi, the Jewish fraternity, great major Jewish organization.
Yeah.
Now, granted, I mean, you have a chapter on multiple college campuses. You're dealing with thousands of people. That I can understand.
That's true.
But J Street didn't make it.
J Street being the self-proclaimed pro-Israel, pro-peace organization, applied for membership, and they needed something like
34 votes.
34 votes, 33 votes, and they only got 17. And therefore, after they were rejected, a number of people complained about, number one, about not getting into the Conference of Presidents, which is supposedly the largest of all tables within the Jewish community, and number 2, about the meaning of the Conference of Presidents, and number 3, about the power structures within the Conference of Presidents. Because, among other things, how many votes does the Reform Movement have?
I think the Reform Movement and the Conservative Movement each have 4 votes functionally, because they have 4 different organizations that are represented, sub-organizations that are represented in the conference. So of the 17 votes that went to J Street, almost a little less than half of them came just from the Reform and Conservative Movement's official organizations.
Right.
And
there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it means there is a concentration of interest within the left and the conservative blocs.
Well, and then there's the question of how many of these are right-wing Zionist organizations, and there are a large number of right-wing Zionist organizations.
Well,
but
that's the other part is how many of these are organizations that have very little membership per se?
Yeah, I mean, some of these are small organizations. Some others have very little budget. I mean, the question certainly arises as to what qualifies as major when we're talking about major Jewish organizations. Some of these organizations I would not qualify as major, at least not anymore. They may have been major 50 years ago, some of them, but some are not major now. Certainly not ones that some of them are ones that I'm not even familiar with.
And plus which there's crossover of membership. So one can be a member of the conservative movement and also a member within JCPA and a member of APAC, and so there's sort of like interlocking memberships to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, you and I probably interact with a dozen or more organizations on this list every year. Fairly easily, I mean, significantly interact with that many organizations every
absolutely.
year.
Not AEPI necessarily, although.
No, but I mean, the American Jewish Committee, APAC, American Jewish Congress.
Yeah, and look at
JDC.
Not JDate, right?
Not JDate. JDate is not on here.
Okay.
Anti-Defamation League for sure. ARTSA is a reform movement organization.
Right.
CCAR, I'm a member of the CCAR. I work with ARTSA, Israel Bonds, CAMRA. We had Dexter Van Zyl on this show.
So David, what's your opinion? Is it intended to be an organization that has bona fides and yet whatever its opinion deserves to sit around the table?
Well, my question about this vote was, is it generally a formality? Is it the point where when you think you're big enough to belong to this organization, you're big enough to belong to this organization? Or is it a matter of whether or not your policies are appropriate to belong to the organization? And I don't think that has been the litmus test historically. Although maybe it has. I mean, maybe some of the organizations that have problematic views on BDS or boycott, divestment, sanctions, and other things probably didn't want to belong to the organization, and so that made it easy.
Well, Jewish Voice for Peace, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, and I think they may have both figured that they wouldn't get elected and didn't want to be elected.
Yeah. Although, the question is, if you do get elected, you do have a voice, and you can at least claim that regardless of the severity of your opinions, that it's you're part of the tent. And everybody wants to be part of the tent, obviously.
Well, and the question is this the entire tent? My question is, and I guess the issue that I have in looking at what the Conference of Presidents is the Conference of Presidents, if you look at the information about what the Conference of Presidents says that it does, and this is from the Conference of Presidents website, that it advances the interests of the American Jewish community, sustains broad-based support for Israel, and addresses the critical concerns facing world Jewry. Now, if you just leave it at that, broad-based support for Israel is going to have to be more than center-right and right-wing support for Israel. It's going to have to be more than center-left support of Israel. That's a pretty broad mission statement. But what they actually do, the conference is at the forefront, mobilizing support to halt Iran's nuclear program and to counter the global campaign to delegitimize Israel and the Jewish people. Now, that starts eliminating groups. What they actually do is advocate for what I would essentially say is a center-right to center-left agenda in that center area, which means that some of the right-wing organizations are not going to really have their agenda represented, and the left wing isn't necessarily going to have its agenda represented either. They may be included under the umbrella, but
right, if that's the goal of the organization, then there will be dissidents on both sides.
Yeah, and it's interesting that stuff is part of what there are organizations that are members of it that I don't know would say that those are their major issues.
So the question is whether this happened by accretion. In other words, over the years, people lost track of what the mission statement was, or didn't think that the mission statement was that binding and wanted to come around the table, and therefore you get lots of organizations that are smaller.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's happened, obviously, is that AIPAC has continued to grow over the years.
It certainly has.
And now encompasses pretty much the political center going pretty far into the right and pretty far into the left. You have to be pretty far to the left or pretty far to the right to not feel that AIPAC is representative of your views in any significant way. So you have Zionist Organization of America on the right wing, and J Street, JVP, and some others on the left wing. But the vast majority of American Jews fit in the AIPAC category alone.
Right.
So the question is, what qualifies as a major organization, and what is the purpose of the conference? You have something like the Reform movement, which alone represents 1 million people, and a conservative movement, something close to that. And then you have some of these organizations that represent 5,000 people, 1,000 people.
Yeah.
What qualifies as a major organization? They're not in the same ballpark.
Yeah. So do you think the conference is looking at these issues?
My assumption is that the conference represents the members of the conference. The organization represents its membership. I would assume that if an organization didn't really feel like it was being represented, then it could leave, which is a different issue.
I suppose.
But the purpose of bringing unity and being part of the center dialogue, I think, is more important than whether or not you're included. And the argument that the reform and conservative movements are going to bail on this conference because it didn't take J Street in, or who knows what other organizations could come up in the future and create similar issues of the progressive movements wanting something and the others not.
But it's more than that. We were discussing the fact that if you want other diversity, you enfranchise the partisan political committees that work with both the Republicans and Democrats.
And this is an issue. I mean, you got to point out, and you're mentioning it now, that the Republican Jewish Coalition and the National Jewish Democratic Council are not
represented
part of this. So that the organizations that actually specifically endorse candidates are not a part of the conference. And so, J Street, which mimics in a lot of ways the National Jewish Democratic Committee, particularly in its support for the president and its support for certain Democratic candidates. It's not a bipartisan organization. It seems to be the National Jewish Democratic Council dealing with Israel, and in that way. Certainly some of the Republican-leaning organizations, more conservative organizations here, might say, not only do we not want this to be a partisan organization, meaning the Conference of Presidents, but if they did that, when we'd also have to apply all these other organizations, you'd end up with a political power struggle going on instead of advocacy.
Yeah. Well, the underlying theme there is the fact that most people think that AIPAC is a political action group, and it's a committee, and it's not. AIPAC.
It doesn't endorse candidates.
Does not endorse candidates, but in fact, the J Street does. So to me, on that basis alone, there was reason to look at it very critically.
Now, there may be some other organizations on this list that endorse candidates too. I don't know.
I don't know either.
And one of the problems I have is in dealing with the Conference of American Presidents vote is that I'm not entirely familiar with all these organizations, nor am I familiar with the actual functioning of the Congress of the Conference of Presidents.
For the time I've been aware of the Conference of Presidents, the single name that stands out over the years has been Malcolm Hoenlein.
Yeah.
And he's all over the place, and he's very articulate, and we've seen him probably talk in various conferences. But more than that, other than the fact that they publish the Daily Alert, I'm not actually sure on what they do, although the information on Wikipedia seems to divide it this way. On Wikipedia, the great source of understanding, thinks that AIPAC works with the Congress and Conference of Presidents works with the President. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that's necessarily correct.
I don't think it's correct.
I do think that it is the case that the Conference of Presidents has the ability to, from an executive position, at least claim that they represent the leaders of these organizations. So obviously, if you're Heinlein Heinlein becomes the president of presidents, right?
The King of Kings.
But at the same time, these organizations all have their own relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, we've gone from Eisenhower, which didn't want to meet with the president, to now having each of these organizations, at least many of these organizations, have their own independent relationship with the sitting president, whoever it is. The Democratic organizations with the Democratic president, the Republican-leaning organizations with the Republican president.
Yes.
I guarantee you some of these organizations would only go to speak to a Republican, and some of them would only go to speak to a Democrat. They wouldn't even bother at times when it's not the case.
So
but in times of real trial in the Jewish community,
yes, you need something.
I could
in the
see this
middle.
umbrella organization playing a much more significant role than it otherwise would.
But the fact, though, so would JCPA and the Jewish federations. JCPA itself, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, is an umbrella group that is not only the umbrella of JCRCs across the country, but the 15 top major Jewish watchdog organizations. So it's like one of those nesting dolls. Hard to figure out.
Well, and we also know, that sitting in Iowa, we are really in the center of the political universe, and all these other organizations are just listening to us.
Yeah, that's what we think.
So we just tell them what to do from here.
And they do.
And they do.
And they do.
Everybody thinks they fly over. They don't fly over. They stop right here, and they listen to us, and then we send them on their way.
That's right.
So there are a lot of other things going on.
Okay, what else? Let's talk about the Pope?
Well, let's talk about the Pope a little bit. So what did you think of the Pope's visit? What were your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it was a very short visit. It was intended, for all we could tell, to bridge the gap with the Orthodox, not the Jewish Orthodox, but the Christian Orthodox. Bartholomew, who's essentially the Pope for the Greek Orthodox tradition, had a meeting with Pope Francis, and that is to patch up part of the rift that was created in 1054 or something like that. So it is a huge part of the Christian world, most likely seen in the Middle East. And, what I've been reading indicates that was the basic reason that the Pope came.
And the leader of the Maronite Church came in?
Yeah. And what is the significance of that, David?
And he's the first leader of the Maronite Church to come since 1948, and he yesterday led a prayer service with the southern Lebanese Christians who had to flee into Israel to avoid being attacked in Lebanon, and the Pope went to all kinds of different places in Israel on these very formal, Israel and the Palestinian territories on this very formal agenda, trying to avoid major political overtones and
he didn't avoid them.
Well, but as I think Javier Gur pointed out today at Times of Israel, he did a very good job of simply being there instead of taking, instead of saying anything that would inflame the situation or anything like that. He made it so that the Palestinians could see him on their side, the Israelis could see them on their side, and he could be able to work with everybody moving forward. And as Javier Reddick-Gur said, it was really a victory for the Catholics. But I don't think it was for the Palestinian Catholics, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah, I'll explain that then.
Well, I mean, I think the Palestinian Catholics really wanted him to take a hardline anti-Israel perspective, and he didn't do it. What I thought was most significant about this visit was what didn't happen, as opposed to what did. Now, if the Pope is going to come once in a lifetime, maybe twice, if he reigns for a very long time as Pope, the Palestinians needed him to come in and declare 100% support with the Palestinian side and none with the Israeli side, and he didn't do that. The narrative that you end up with is a very moderate narrative Yes, the Pope believes the Palestinians are, suffering in certain ways, and he wants them to have self-determination. He wants there to be a state. But he also went to the Israeli side and went to Theodore Herzl's grave, and he went to the memorial to terror victims, not just to see the separation barrier.
Right.
And he walked through Yad Vashem, and he did a lot of the Israeli secular narrative, not just the Israeli religious narrative. Yes, he did go to the Western Wall, but if you think about it, traditionally, the Palestinian side has wanted to argue that they have a secular narrative and the Jews have a religious narrative. And the reason that you do that is because they also have believed that their religious narrative trumps the Jewish religious narrative. So if the Catholics are, they were dealing with the Palestinians being supersessionist Christians,
Yes.
who believe that they've inherited the blessings of the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
therefore the Jewish religious blessings hold no meaning. Okay, so that if they can present the Israelis as only having a religious narrative that's an invalid religious narrative, then they can present their secular narrative as the only one that anybody should listen to. If the Pope is coming in and then presenting the Israeli secular narrative, which is what he did.
Yes, he did. I agree.
That completely counters the Palestinian secular narrative. And you end up with a situation in which you say, you know what, the Palestinians don't simply get the trump, which has been what has happened. And we've certainly dealt with religious leaders, Christian religious leaders, Catholic and otherwise, who've simply given the Palestinians the trump.
Right.
The Pope didn't do that. He completely undermined that narrative. He completely undermined that argument that Israel has no valid argument here, and no valid reason to be where it is, and no valid reason to do what it does. By going to Yad Vashem, by going to the wall for terror victims, by going to the Western Wall, he validated the entire Israeli side of the narrative.
Right.
So regardless of what happens on the other side, the Pope has validated the Israeli narrative, which means that the best the Palestinian side can hope for now is that the Vatican will advocate for a two-state solution, not a single state.
Now, a couple of interesting things. First of all, the Pope gets along very well with Shimon Peres.
He gets along very well. Who doesn't get along with Shimon Peres? I mean, Shimon Peres is Shimon Peres is a treasure for the Jewish people.
Yes.
He's somebody who's completely irreplaceable. And we're now dealing with the prospect of a new president coming in Israel. A president is kind of a
figurehead.
It's almost a figurehead, but it's really the person who represents the Israeli people.
Yeah.
And Shimon Peres was a perfect person for that, to go meet foreign heads of state, and he's just a lovable character and
articulate
and
as well.
Very articulate, and he had a narrative that people could buy into.
Mm-hmm. He's going to be hard to replace.
Hard, I would say, is impossible to replace. I don't think there's anybody who can replace him. Israel has had a history of every now and then putting somebody in that position who cannot be replaced. It's not a cookie cutter position. These are charismatic individuals who are oftentimes seen as an alternative means to address the Israeli population from whoever the prime minister is.
Yes.
And when you've got a center-right to right-wing prime minister, having your center-left to left-wing president helps. You're not going to have that now.
Except that Shimon Peres was always particularly critical of Netanyahu.
Yeah, but I mean that just meant that President Obama, for example, he might not be able to talk to Netanyahu, but he might be able to talk to Perez instead.
Yes.
Rivlin is not going to be that way.
No.
So the next president of Israel is going to be somebody who is maybe even more right-wing than Netanyahu is. And that's going to make it much more difficult to at least have that formal diplomatic conversation.
Now, among the 6 who are running, and the election, it's not an election, it's a selection by the Knesset, essentially. will take place in the middle of June, probably while we're there, perhaps.
Could be.
One
Maybe they'll have an audience with us. What do you think?
But why not? Why not? One of the people who are running is Danny Shechtman, who's the winner of Nobel Prize for, I guess it's a physics type of award he got. Shechtman, who has a cross appointment with Iowa State University and has spent a good number of years part-time in Iowa. He wants to use the presidency as a platform by dint of his Nobel Prize to impress upon Israel the need for education.
Well, I don't know how difficult it is to impress on Israel the need for education. It's one of the leading education places in the entire world. So just saying, China just signed this agreement with Tel Aviv University. The dynamic has changed. We're looking at some very strange dynamics coming out of Israel right now. I don't think Americans realize what's going on. You're dealing with, as I'm looking at Times of Israel right now, the news about the Palestinian unity deal with Fatah and Hamas. Okay, so you've got a situation in which they're now talking about Ismail Haniyeh being the Speaker of the Palestinian Parliament. Ismail Haniyeh is the head of Hamas. Okay. Hamas doesn't even recognize the possibility of negotiating a truce with Israel, much less agreeing to a long-term concession with Israel.
Now, what we're hearing about possible American reactions, it's all multiple dimensional. The first is when you make peace, is it even realistic to make peace with the Palestinians when they have Hamasniks and Fatahniks separated to begin with?
Well, I always thought that Israel could make peace with the West Bank, but not necessarily with Gaza.
So that would mean a three-state solution, David.
Or at this point, a two-state and maybe not the third at the moment solution.
Okay.
In other words, there was always the possibility that Gaza would fall back into the control of Fatah, or some sort of secular nationalist government.
Yes.
And at that point in time, you could potentially have an agreement with the people of Gaza. And it could be the same agreement you have with the people of the West Bank. The problem now is that you're talking about creating an agreement with a government that says it will and will not honor it. How do you do that?
I don't know. The American administration, or at least the State Department, is hinting that it would recognize the unity government, even if and even though Hamas will not live up to the preconditions that it needs to in order to validly be a player again from the table.
Let's talk about why they're willing to do that. Because if they don't do that, they need to shut off all contact, and they need to remove all support. And Congress may do that anyway. But if the U.S., first of all, it also doesn't make any sense to say we're not going to recognize the government that a people has.
Well, it
makes sense to recognize. If the Palestinians say they have a unity government, it makes sense for us to say, okay, that's your government. Why in the world would we say we're not going to recognize the unity government? We're only going to recognize Fatah, even though Fatah says it's not the government anymore.
For one reason, because Hamas is still on the U.S. State Department list of international terrorist organizations.
Well, that just means that there are requirements that we should be following after we recognize the unity government. The question should not be whether or not we recognize the unity government that the Palestinians say they have. The question is, what do we do about it after we do? Now, it seems to me that if the reality is they have a unity government that involves a terrorist organization that we have said we cannot fund, that means our funding is gone. Period. End of story. Let's talk. Let's talk about something else. It is not a situation in which we can pretend that Fatah is somehow the government, even though they're not. I mean, we cannot continue. There have been all these articles about magical thinking in dealing with the Middle East, dealing with the peace process. Yeah. It is magical thinking to look at something and say to yourself, it's not what I'm looking at. It's even more magical thinking when you look at something and you say, it is Hamas and Fatah working together, but I'm going to pretend it's not Hamas and Fatah. I mean, it's bad enough when you don't acknowledge what's there, but when you actually acknowledge what's there and then pretend you're not seeing it, it's even worse. So we're talking about acknowledging the fact that Ismail Haniyeh is going to be the prime minister of this government, going to be going to be the speaker of the parliament. But we're going to pretend that his party is not involved. Really? It makes no sense.
Well, a lot of things in that area make no sense. Let me divert us to talking about possible unilateral moves by the Israelis. Have you followed that issue?
Well, I think the unilateral moves as far as borders and things like that are really long term. I don't think there's anything that's going to push the Israelis to do it anytime soon. In other words, I don't see Israel withdrawing from 60% of the West Bank or something like that as a unilateral move. I don't see Israel, at least not anytime soon, because the security consequences of that are significant. You have to have the only way you make any of those concessions is if the alternative is worse. Israel would not unilaterally withdraw unless it were under threat that if it didn't unilaterally withdraw, something would happen.
Something really bad.
So if for example, the UN Security Council, for example, said, if Israel hasn't withdrawn from X territory by X date, we're going to recognize all of the territory as being part of Israel and demand that it recognize, voting privileges for everybody. Unless something like that happened, I can't even imagine what would force the hand to do anything here.
So you don't think something is imminent?
I don't think anything's imminent because the security fallout would be huge. And I also think that the Palestinian side doesn't want it. I think there's a public narrative that's going on here, and there's a private narrative that's going on here. The public narrative is that from the Palestinian side is that things are awful and they need to change quickly and everybody needs to force Israel to make concessions so the Palestinians can have self-determination. The reality is that they can communicate with the people in Gaza, create a unity government. They have all kinds of investment coming in both Gaza and the West Bank from businesses. The Palestinian business people don't want any of this stuff to happen because they don't want the threat of having their businesses collapse. They're in a great position right now in the business climate, and there's no incentive to change whatsoever. They have no incentive to make any compromise whatsoever that would potentially threaten their current situation. So that's the behind the scenes. The other behind the scenes is that the other Arab governments don't want to continue to push this issue. They want to work with Israel. And you've got China and India who have been probably behind the scenes telling the Arabs, we're going to continue to support the Palestinian cause and the Arab cause and hold off from working with Israel until the peace process is over to give you the best chance of making the best deal. Well, China just blew that out of the water. China is now actively, publicly working with Israel and on a huge investment. And not only that, but they're planning on increasing that even more. And you've got a new Indian government that is now a very close ally of Israel that's talking about enormous investment too. And the fact that India has come over and become a strong ally of Israel undermines the entire non-aligned bloc at the United Nations. Because just China and India alone are 36% of the world's population.
Yeah. It's
hard to talk about a country being isolated when you've got strong relations with 40, 50% of the world's population. There are very few countries that have very few other countries that have good relations with 50% of the world's population. So this argument that somehow Israel is going to be pressured, that removes a lot of the pressure of the whole boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. It removes a lot of the delegitimization pressure. In fact, it ramps it up on Europe because what ends up happening is now Europe's really the only bloc of countries that are even talking about putting any pressure on Israel. And they're going to be loath to do it if it's not going to give them anything. And the economic pressure that they're going to get simply from not having access to the Israeli technology is going to harm them. In addition to that, you now have this situation, and I brought it up at the beginning of the show, these far right-wing parties in Europe, most of them are anti-Muslim parties. And the Jews get drawn into that. But these are mostly anti-Muslim parties and anti-immigrant parties.
By drawn in, you mean?
I mean that usually when far right groups persecute Muslims, they throw Jews in, and Jews get persecuted along with the Muslims, along with various immigrant parties. Most of these parties are nationalistic. They tend to see Jews as foreign agents, even if they've lived in the country for hundreds of years. They tend to be foreign agents, seen as foreign agents in the country, part of some other people. There's the movie about the swim team in Vienna,
Hakoach.
about Hakoach, and one of the cab drivers, watermarks, and one of the cab drivers in the movie is talking to a woman, and she says, well, my family was here. My family had lived here for 400 years before the Holocaust. And he says, yes, but you're not German. Or, yes, but you're not Austrian. Your family had been there for 400 years, but they weren't considered Austrians.
Yeah.
That's the right-wing point of view. That Jews are, simply residents in the country or whatever, the same as immigrants from other places are, even if they've been there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jews end up getting brought into this. So the fact that these parties are focused on significant Muslim immigration, France, which now has 15-20% Muslim population, something like that, mostly from North Africa.
Yeah.
Germany's got a significant population, Spain, Britain. These parties tend to be anti-Muslim parties and anti-immigrant parties. Jews are part of that immigrant experience in most of these places.
Except
so the focus isn't on Jews, but these are anti.
But the kicker is we've seen a couple of personal attacks on Jews, again, within the last week.
And then the question is whether or not these are done by Muslim organizations or done by far right-wing organizations. A lot of the anti-Semitism in Europe has been Muslim anti-Semitism. A lot of the attacks have been done by Muslims against Jews. We don't know in this case whether we're dealing with that or not, but it seems relatively likely that that's what we're dealing with.
Two cases. The one
in Brussels,
inside it was inside the Jewish museum in Brussels, and the other outside the synagogue in France.
Yeah, and it could be that both of those are similar attacks for different reasons. I mean, Jews are also drawn in because of economic situations in some of these countries. That when economic times are bad, Jews are often blamed for the economic situation. And so that's also another reason that some of these groups are on the rise. There's also nationalist issues. You have a European Union now. Many of these groups are actually opposed to the European Union. They're nationalist groups.
And the fact is that some of these groups have flags with a semi-configured swastika on them.
And they'd probably have fully configured swastikas if it wasn't illegal.
Yep, of course.
I mean, so we're dealing with groups that have been, trying to mimic what the Nazis did, especially Jobbik in Hungary,
yes,
and the party in Greece. Now, some of these groups very clearly are nationalist, and they're dealing with countries that have lost a lot of stature. They're minor bit players in Europe. They don't want to be minor bit players in Europe. They certainly don't want to be poor minor bit players in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they're dealing with. So we're seeing the rise of that at the same time, and so there's a lot of pressure on European Jews in a number of different places: France, Belgium, Ukraine, to potentially make Aliyah to Israel, and they may well in the next not too long.
And they are. The stats seem to indicate that at least 75% of French Jews have contemplated immigration.
Yeah, well, I mean, a large percentage of Jews, I think, around the world, period, have contemplated immigration. So I don't know what that percentage would be even in the United States. If you talk about what level of contemplation are you talking about here? There are days when you get frustrated with what the president says or what the Congress does.
Yes.
I'm out of here. Am I going to go to Canada? Am I going to go to Mexico? Am I going to go to Israel?
And they end up staying.
It's either you saying that you want to leave, or it's somebody else saying, "Okay, go." You go.
You go. Right.
Go ahead, leave. You don't like it here, leave. There's, I think, the thing that I'm struck most by this is is with the statement, when I see these things happen, I say, thank God there's an Israel. Thank God it's even an alternative for those Jews to think about where they that they want to leave,
Yes.
that they have the ability to leave. Because in the 1920s and 1930s, when this was happening, they didn't have a place to go.
That's true.
And it's an important issue not to be lost. I think as we deal with the situation in Russia also and in Ukraine, Israel ends up being kind of a neutral party in this discussion, and it can actually help be the peacemaker in some of these discussions. I think the Russians and the Ukrainians are both interacting with Israeli diplomats who cross sides, who have relations on both sides. In a lot of these former Soviet republics and in the Soviet Union. It has been made the case that before too long you could have an Israeli prime minister whose native language is Russian.
Conceivable.
Or at least who has a primary language of Russian.
Right.
And if that's the case, you certainly make it easier to relate to Russia and the Russian republics.
Well, that's why Avigdor Lieberman is always seen to be somebody who could relate to Russia.
Well, and it's another interesting people forget. Benjamin Netanyahu held out to have Lieberman as his foreign minister, and people were upset about that because of his relationship with the peace process. But I think it's entirely conceivable that he had him as foreign minister because he realized that a number of their challenges would involve Russia, and that for Lieberman to be able to speak to his Russian counterpart in Russian, dealing with Iran or Syria or Georgia
advantage.
or Ukraine or any of these places is a huge advantage that very few other countries have, and no other countries in the West have. I mean, think about what other country in the West, other than a former Soviet republic, would have the ability to have a native Russian speaker be your foreign minister to interact with Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, the impact of that is enormous. Dealing with the situation with India, to have a new prime minister of India who's already been doing business with Israel for over a decade in his home province. The impact of that, as far as Israel's foreign policy and foreign relations with India, is also huge. I'm trying to think of what other issues we want to...
Let me ask you, I guess President Obama made a speech about foreign policy at the West Point graduation. And besides simply just saying he's looking for a foreign policy that will not entangle American troops in many places where not necessary, did not mention the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, because I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is now in a situation in which it's very difficult to see a path forward that's going to get anybody to the table, primarily because there's no real threat. The Palestinian side doesn't want to engage in violence because there's no positive they can gain from it. They talked about putting forward interaction at the UN, and they were going to push hard for the interaction at the UN right after the current peace process collapsed. I think, and I mean, from my perspective, it's when Jose Maria Ocampo came out and said, "Yeah, but you'd be beholden to the ICC too, not just Israel." That they backed off, because what would happen if the UN's own country, I mean, functionally, the Palestinian Authority right now is a UN protectorate. It's a UN organization. The UN Welfare Relief Agency is functionally the Palestinian Authority. I mean, that's a huge percentage of their budget. It's a huge percentage of their workers. It's a huge percentage of a lot of other stuff. For them to be convicted of a war crime ends all that. Gone. Immediately. We can talk about whether or not Congress is going to continue funding of the current government. The whole UN agency would cease to exist rapidly if that happen. So the consequences of that stuff is difficult. There are also the issue that they may well have been convinced that they had less of a legal case than they thought they did. Mm-hmm. In which case, then even going to the legal organizations to begin, even going and trying to argue about the settlement issue and things like that, they don't have as strong a case because the UN General Assembly doesn't make law. And so all of these various resolutions that they have wanted to argue make things illegal or not actually don't, and according to international law. So they've gone from war to terrorism to boycott, divestment, sanctions, and delegitimization, which is a much weaker position. And even that's weakened, and it's even weakened further now because of India and China. So the ability for the Palestinians to really put pressure on Israel is in any way is very, very weak, and the ability for Europe and the United States to put pressure on Israel to do anything is gone. Doesn't even exist.
Maybe a final topic about Iran. It says the next round of full Iran nuclear talks will be held in Vienna, June 16th to 20th.
Is that before or after they have their nuclear test?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, my belief is that we haven't seen, we've literally seen nothing happen. They've been talking about when to talk, and we've gone through months.
Yeah, but the deal is supposed to be wrapped up by July 20th or extended.
And then we'll see whether it's a valid deal, or whether it's a good deal, or whether anybody can accept the deal, or whether they'll follow the deal even if it is a good deal.
Well, we're also hearing that the U.S. has reestablished back-channel relations with Iran to try to come to that deal.
Well, we're looking at a situation in which they did all of these things to try to get something solved in Syria. Hasn't done anything in Syria. We have not really seen much of anything happen as far as success in dealing with Iran and the nuclear reactor and the nuclear material. We have seen, Syria's chemical weapons were supposed to be destroyed. That hasn't happened. There's not really a whole lot of incentive going on here. And in the meantime, I think that the Israelis, by working with India and China and Russia, may have a better way to put pressure on the Iranians than even going through the UN negotiations. So it's entirely possible that the U.S. took it as far as it could, and Israel has already changed tack and trying to work with other governments dealing with Iran behind the scenes. The Israelis' purpose is to stop the program, not to stop the program publicly. So if they can get China and Russia to pressure Iran and actually get the job done, I think they'd rather have it done that way than to worry about what the United States is doing. Yeah. So we're anyway, lots to think about over the next few months. We're going to be off the air on summer break, basically. Lots of things going on this summer, but we're not going to be doing the show every week. So the show, hopefully, that's the plan anyway, will be back on the air probably in mid-August, certainly mid to late August. That's the target date. And we hope that everyone has a wonderful June, July, and early August. And we will... if you're interested in keeping up to date on what's going on to Israel, I will try to post things on my blog at 12talk2.com. That's the numbers, 12talk and the number 2.com. And we'll keep you up to date. With that, hope you have a great summer.
Get away from us, you need old credit card. We don't have any more money. We're in trouble now. Save us! Help! Somebody save us! Somebody help! Help! Save us!
Hi, I'm Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of Des Moines. If your credit card's a little too animated, give us a call.
Hooray! We're saved! Consumer Credit! You're our hero!